The thing with these live cinema pieces is that they only happen live. You know, people often say, like, well, how can I see the Buckminster Fuller piece? And I'm like, well, are you going to be in Belgium on September 12th? You know, it's kind of
That's
hard.
the agony of the ephemerality right there.
Exactly.
Welcome back to Working. I'm your host, June Thomas.
And I'm your other host, Isaac Butler.
Isaac, it has been so long. I've missed chatting with you terribly.
I've missed you too, June. I've missed you too. I assume you don't have a heat dome in Edinburgh right now?
That would be correct, yes. No heat domes. No heat, actually. It's great. Loving it.
Yeah. You just have a peat
It's
fog.
got a little peat fire.
Just a little peat fire
burning.
dome?
Just burning in the corner. No worries. Tell me, Isaac, whose voice did we hear at the top of the show?
That was Sam Green. You know, what Sam does is a little bit difficult to describe. And in fact, he talks about that in the interview itself. But the easiest way to say this is he is a filmmaker who has pioneered a new hybrid form, the live documentary.
Wow. And why did you want to speak with Sam right now?
Well, right now, there is a retrospective of Sam's work happening at Lincoln Center. And if you don't see Sam's work live, you basically can't see it, with the exception of one of his movies, 32 Sounds, which is now available on DVD. But they're really live experiences. They don't exist in a codified form.
Wow.
So first of all, it was a really great opportunity for me and our producer Cameron to see some of that work because we hadn't been able to see it before. And, you know, when their PR people at Lincoln Center pitched me on him, I was like, this is a great thing. I love documentaries. I love live theater. I love Yo La Tango, who did the music to one of the movies. Let's make this work.
Yes, indeed. I bet you enjoyed that. I cannot wait to hear that conversation. But tell me, is there something extra just for Slate Plus members? What will they hear?
You know it, June. That is not a question that's filled with a lot of suspense. That's not like, oh God, is there going to be something for Slate Plus listeners? But no, we have a smorgasbord of really fun questions about kind of his life, like the life of someone who goes on the road doing these documentaries. What is it like to take a show on the road? Does he like touring? How does he see his work developing in the future? Those sorts of things.
Fascinating. If you are a member of Slate Plus, you'll hear that at the end of the episode. And if you aren't, it is super easy to join. As a Slate Plus member, you get to hear extra segments on this show and others like the Culture Gabfest. You'll get bonus episodes of podcasts like Slow Burn and Amicus. And of course, you will never hit a paywall on slate.com. To learn more, go to slate.com/workingplus. All right, let's hear Isaac's conversation with Sam Green. Get 3% daily cash back when you use Apple Card to buy a new iPhone 15 or pair of AirPods at Apple. You can choose to grow it at 4.4% annual percentage yield when you open a savings account through Apple Card. Apply for Apple Card in the Wallet app on iPhone, subject to credit approval. Savings is available to Apple Card owners subject to eligibility. Savings and Apple Card by Goldman Sachs Bank USA, Salt Lake City branch. Member FDIC. Terms and more at applecard.com.
Sam Green, thank you so much for joining us this week on Working to talk about your process.
Very happy to be here, Isaac. Thanks for having me.
So let's just start with the most basic of questions for our listeners who aren't familiar with your work. How do you describe what you do?
I tell people, you know, if I'm sitting next to somebody on a plane, I say, I'm a documentary filmmaker. And they always say, cool, I love documentary films. And I'm like, what documentary films do you like? And they're like, Cops, Nature on BBC.
Right.
Like, then what have you made? You know, and I'm like, The Weather Underground. You know, it's always one of these slightly awkward things. But I say I'm a documentary filmmaker, and I believe I am a documentary filmmaker.
Right. Yes. And one of the things that you have pioneered over the course of your career is the live documentary form. And for our listeners who we'll explain that in a second, this is a little bit different from documentary theater, which is based on primary source material and interviews and stuff, and then those are performed by actors. This is something quite different from that. So how do you describe your live documentaries?
Yeah, this is the next struggle. If I really want to get into it with somebody, say, I make these live documentaries. They're all the elements of a regular film, but it just happens live. So I am on stage and I narrate while a film is on the screen, and there's a band or a musical ensemble playing a live soundtrack. And the thing with these live cinema pieces is that they only happen live. You can't stream them on YouTube or Netflix. It's only an ephemeral thing that you have to go to the theater to see. And so you came the other day to see the love song of our Buckminster Fuller, the piece I made with Yo La Tengo. And we've been traveling around doing that for many years. And sometimes people write me and say, hey, could I watch that on the internet? And I said, no, unfortunately, it only happens live. But it's a form I like. I'm into both making that kind of work, but also I like it in the context of the world today. I like something that's ephemeral.
Yeah, totally. I could talk about ephemerality all day. I come from a theater background. What to you is the power of that ephemerality?
Well, I sort of backed into this idea in around 2010. And it was around the time when people were first starting to watch movies on their computers. And I noticed with myself, I would watch a movie and check my email occasionally, or I'd pause it and I'd go check what's in the refrigerator. And I don't want to be too precious about it, but with my own work, I really would want people to have a big experience and to give themselves over to it and turn their phone off and really be present. So a lot of it came out of that, just wanting to make something. And then I started doing it, and it just was so fun. I love traveling around with bands. I've never been in a band, but this is as close as I can get to being in a band, and musicians are great. And also I learned so much about performance and performing arts, which I really knew nothing about. And you as a theater person certainly know about. But it was funny in the beginning, my partner's a choreographer, and she influenced me to some extent. I said to her, hey, Kat, did you know, after I did a couple shows, I said, did you know that when you're in front of an audience, you can feel their energy?
Right.
And she was like, duh, like that's performance 101. Like, but as a filmmaker, you're always watching from the back. You make the film and you're not super tuned into an audience's experience. Did they laugh? They didn't laugh. They didn't walk out. You're not in front of them and really plugged into it, which is an incredible experience. Really, the connection between you and the work and the audience is profound, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree.
You know that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I come from a directing background. You also feel it when you're sitting in the audience. Like part of what your job is as a director is to kind of, read whatever that collective animal is kind of thinking and figuring out. How does the live format, the basic fundamental value that this is going to be performed live, how does that shape the process of, like composing the work, researching the work, and putting the work together?
That's a great question. One of the things I liked about the form is that because it's weird and people are not familiar with a sort of live movie form, you don't have expectations. People don't come with expectations. If you see a regular documentary, and there's like 45 seconds of music, you'd start to think like, all right, already, enough. The form and the language, the cinematic language enough to know like 45 seconds is too long for a music break. Any kind of music documentary, it's 30 seconds max probably. So I like the form a lot because you don't have expectations. You saw in the Buckminster Fuller piece, there's long breaks where they just play. And it's funny because there's that section where I just show images of domes from around the world. And they're playing, and it's probably 3 minutes long. In a normal movie, it'd be like, this kind of sucks. This is going on too long. But in that space when they're playing and, it's just like people will go with it and it's fine.
And, is there a way that you experience it before it's live? Like, do you make a demo version? To take the Buckminster Fuller one as an example, like, is there a version where, there's like a rough demo of Yo La Tengo's music and it's played over your edit and then you've done voiceover so kind of roughly what it's going to be like?
Yeah, so I edit it together like a regular movie in a way, and I use their music sort of as I put it in there and put my voiceover in there and looked at it. But even in there, I was imagining how this would work in a space. Okay. And it's funny because remember that scene? There's a scene where it's at Buckminster Fuller's greatest building, this dome he designed for the World's Expo in Montreal. And it's this really beautiful color footage. It was 1967. And when we were making that, the band made this piece of music for that section, and it was really huge and cacophonous. And I said, you guys, this is way too big. It's never going to work. And they were like, it will work. And I said, no. And normally with a movie, the director's just like, no,
right,
make me something else. But, the relationship is a little different when they're playing. They've got, they have some agency that you sort of have to respect. So I said, I really don't think it's going to work. And they said, how about we'll do it the first show? If it doesn't work, we'll change it. We'll make something different. I was like, okay, what harm could be done? We did it. It's great. It's fucking great. It's this huge, like, cacophonous piece of music, and it somehow gets at the grandiosity of the vision, the design, the beautiful colors. And they were right. They were totally right. So that process of trying to imagine how this will play in a room, it's certainly what all theater people do, and probably to some extent what musicians do.
We do workshops and previews. Do you know what I mean? We do all these things before
with I never did that with Buckminster Fuller, but with the Kronos Quartet thing and 32 Sounds, I went to Mass Mocha and spent a week, and we put it together and did a workshop in sort of the way a theater piece would be workshopped. Got
it. What was your first live documentary? Was that the Utopias one?
Yeah, it was called Utopia in 4 Movements, and I made it in 2010. And it happened because I was making this experimental movie about utopia. It was 4 different stories about utopia that were unconnected. And I thought a viewer will watch it and make all these cool connections themselves. And I showed a rough cut to friends of mine, and everybody who saw it said, this doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And I was like completely devastated, because your fantasy is that people will say, it's perfect, don't change a frame. You somehow nailed it. So I was completely crushed and stuck. I'd never made a movie with any voiceover. When I started, that was like the worst thing in the world, voiceover. And so somebody asked me to do a talk about the project. I was in the middle of making this project, and I thought, okay, I'll talk and I'll show some clips, and that might be kind of boring, so I'll get somebody to do some live music. It'll just be like this fancy lecture. And I did it, and it worked just the way I wanted the movie to work. It was like, oh, people got it. People hung out afterwards and had a good time. Like, oh, I just filed that away. And then somebody else, a film festival, asked me to do the talk about that project. And I made it even fancier. I got another musician, and that worked too. And then I just sort of thought, well, I've never heard of a live documentary, but that's the form that it sort of wants to be. And I did a show at Sundance of that Utopian 4 Movements, and thought, well, that's that. But then a lot of people wanted to show it, and we traveled all over the world for several years doing it. And it was just really fun. I loved it. And the tools, a big image and big sound and having people with their phones off, I kind of got addicted to it.
Yeah, totally. So you've been doing this for almost 15 years. You've done a number of projects in this form. Do you yearn to go back to traditional documentary filmmaking, or are you just sort of like, I just love doing this live shit, man.
Well, it's funny. I do love doing the live shit. The drawback is that, you know, people often say like, well, how can I see the Buckminster Fuller piece? And I'm like, well, are you going to be in Belgium on September 12th? You know, if you are, you can see it there. So it's like, it's kind of
That's
hard.
the agony of the ephemerality right there.
Exactly. But with 32 Sounds, the most recent one I made, unlike all the other live cinema pieces I've made, it felt like it could also work as a regular movie. So we have a fancy live version that I do with J.D. Sampson, but we have a regular version that played at Film Forum, and it's still good, and it's a little different, but it works. So
you wear headphones during it, right? The one at Film Forum?
Some shows you wear headphones, but there's a version where you don't. If it's like 7.1 or 5.1, that can work too. So that was the first time I came back to regular movies and made something. And sometimes I would go to do a Q&A or something, and I'd be like, this is so easy. You just have to show up afterwards. You don't even have to be sober. You know what I mean? You just talk. Whereas with the live cinema stuff, it's hard. You know, it's almost like an athletic event. So I like both.
Obviously, your documentary about the Kronos Quartet is going to feature the Kronos Quartet as the band.
Yeah.
But how do you find your other collaborators, right? Because your primary collaborator is the whatever composer you're working with.
Yeah. That is a good question. With the Buckminster Fuller piece, so there was the only movie I've ever made that somebody else suggested it. And it was a friend of mine who worked at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. They were doing a show about Buckminster Fuller. And he said, do you want to make a live cinema piece in conjunction with it? You can have access to Fuller's archive. And I said, okay, well, that sounds interesting. Let me go check the archive out. And I imagined it was like 5 boxes in a room. Right. So I said, I'll drive down to Stanford and spend a couple hours looking at the archive. And little do I know, if you haven't seen the piece, it's in some ways all about his archive, which is just the largest archive of any person in the world. It's incredibly huge. So
he saved every piece of paper that crossed his desk for 70 years, right? It's
like
something
everything.
Insane like that.
He's got laundry, his laundry receipts, you know, just literally everything. It's incredible.
I went to this archive once. It was of a theater professor because he had interviewed all these people who are now dead who I wanted to quote in my book. And, you know, it wasn't that large. It was like 30 boxes, but 2 of them were of bills. And then there was one box of he had saved all the headshots from all the actors who had auditioned for him for like the 2 years that he was doing off-Broadway theater in New York.
Wow.
And in there were headshots for Alec Baldwin and Bruce Willis when they were like right out of school.
That is great.
That was totally irrelevant to my project, but I love those weird archival finds.
Totally. And it's great that people save that stuff because most of that is the detritus of history that nobody saves. But so I was really taken with the archive and also Fuller because he's a beautifully hopeful utopian figure with a note of heartbreak in it because the world is what it is. And so I always need music to make a film, an emotional palette and a kind of set of tones. And I'm a big YLT fan, Yo La Tengo. I have been for many, many years. And the thing I like about this music, and probably most people who like them feel the same way, it's like beautiful and heartbreaking, and there's a lot of emotion to it. Their melodies, the way they, just the kind of tones they spit out are magical. And so I was friends with Georgia, the drummer's sister, and I asked if she would ask them if they might be up for it, and they were.
What is that workflow like? At what point are you hearing music during the process? How much are you telling them what you want the feeling of it to be?
I need music to edit. And obviously the composer, musician needs images to work from. So it's this funny horse and cart situation where you kind of go back and forth, and that's the way that happens. But it's also really hard too, and this is something I love, which is trying to talk to musicians about music using words is weird and often comical, you know, because you find yourself saying stuff like, it's very embarrassing actually. Like, could you make something more sugary or a little more spiky? Or, just like these weird things that often are like, what? And some musicians actually can you make something more spiky? And they can make something more spiky. It's incredible. But it's like a very weird process of translation that it's a miracle
totally.
It works.
Yeah, totally. And also there is this thing where it's like, okay, you're saying this should be more sugary and you feel embarrassed about that. But the fact that you and the composer might have different feelings about that word is going to lead them to make something that you don't expect, but is still right. Which 100%. Is like, that's to me when it's like, this is why you have collaborators. Yes. You know what I mean?
Yes, more than the sum of its parts as opposed to less than the sum of its parts.
Yeah, exactly. Preferably.
That's the goal.
Preferably.
Yeah.
We'll be back with more of Isaac's conversation with Sam Green. This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Whether you're driving, cooking, or doing laundry, Progressive knows the podcasts you listen to go best when they're bundled with another activity, much like how their Progressive home and auto policies go best when they're bundled. Having these two policies together makes taking care of your insurance easier and could help you save too. Customers who save by switching their home and car insurance to Progressive save nearly $800 on average. That's a whole lot of savings and protection for your favorite podcast listening activities, like going on a road trip, cooking dinner, and even hitting the home gym. Yep, your home and your car are even easier to protect when you bundle your insurance together. Find your perfect combo. Get a home and car insurance quote at progressive.com today. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $793 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2021 and May 2022. Potential savings will vary. Listeners, we want to hear from you. Every other Thursday on Working Overtime, we offer advice about creative dilemmas. So please tell us your creative challenges and let us help you. Drop us a line at working@slate.com. You can also send a voice memo to that address. Or give us a ring at 304-933-WORK and leave a message. And if you're enjoying this episode, don't forget to follow Working wherever you get your podcasts. Now let's return to Isaac's conversation with Sam Green.
Live performance and documentaries, another thing they have in common is they take a very long time to make. They're not financially remunerative. They're emotionally very intense creative processes. How do you figure out this idea is enough to make it worth, 2 years and raising all the money and, all that stuff? How do you figure out what's the right thing to dedicate that much time and energy to?
Well, I've never been one of those filmmakers or artists who is super strategic and has a list of 10 projects and which one can I raise the most money for. I'm, for better or for worse, and I'm not, this is not a choice, but I'm sort of like, it's almost like falling in love, and I just have an idea and I am obsessed and it sticks with me and I almost can't not do it. So I do think the one thing is, like, I'm just a person with average taste. So I think in some ways I never want to make like total avant-garde work that half the audience will walk out on and, like, fuck it, I don't care what people think. It's my vision. Like, I once saw Brian Eno give a talk at Pratt or one of the art schools here. And he was great. And he said something, I wish I had the exact quote, but he said something like, I absolutely want people to love the work I make. And it was just like this statement of unabashed caring about what an audience thinks and wanting people to be delighted and how, and I was so refreshed by that, because I feel the same way. And oftentimes there's a kind of haughtiness with artists where it's like, I'm not concerned, but I am deeply concerned. And so I want to make work that gets out there. And it's not that I'm, chasing a top 40 type of aesthetic, but, I feel like the work I've made has gotten out there. And I have somehow have been able to make it work, and it works financially. Especially the performing arts world is a different financial world than the film world, and counterintuitively enough, it's a much better world financially. But I'm not, I'm making now a movie about trees, which you could say, like, on one hand, like, well, that sounds kind of not very appealing, or like, wow, how are you going to make a movie about trees? But on the other hand, trees are everywhere. Everybody has some kind of relationship with trees. I love trees. Many people love trees. So the challenge is to make something that's big and fantastic and accessible and poppy. I like pop.
Right. Yeah, totally. You love primary source research. Who doesn't love primary source research? One thing I'm wondering, though, is, how you figure out after you've amassed all of that stuff, how to structure it. Because, as you said, for example, Buckminster Fuller kept every piece of paper he touched for 70 years.
Yeah.
The documentary is 45 minutes long.
Yeah.
It's not, you're not taking us through every day.
It should have been like 7 hours long. You know what I mean? Just
right.
excruciating.
He gave a lecture once that was how long? 42 hours?
42 hours long, called Everything I Know. Yeah.
You could just do that, But anyway, so much of making a work of art is about what's you decide to leave out, actually, not what you decide to leave in. Can you talk to me a bit about your structuring and filtering process?
Well, almost always it's just things that delight me. That's or move me or kind of shake me. I kind of just use myself as a guide. And so with 32 Sounds, for example, it's a movie about sound through 32 kind of vignettes about different sounds. And that was super fun. Very hard to do, but super fun, because it was just sort of like me saying, wow, I wonder what the loudest crowd sound in the world is. And going and figuring out what it was. And that is an example that didn't make it into the film, but lots of other things I thought, wow, I wonder what ever happened to John Cage's stopwatch. I love the sound of stopwatches. Where's his stopwatch? And then that's just sort of following a kind of like fancy in a way. And with Buckminster Fuller, it was the same thing. It was sort of like, oh, I found this footage of him building his dome in his house. Like, that would be a great dance number, and sort of between narrative beats and cinematic musical beats, you kind of figure out, it's almost like making music. You have like a big refrain here and you have a chorus here, and you sort of put something together. Maybe it's more like a symphony in a way.
When you perform them live, you're doing a lot of voiceover narration, right? I guess it's not voiceover if you're physically on stage. You're narrating the documentary. Yep. How scripted is that stuff? Like, have you written a whole thing that you've memorized, or is it sort of like an outline you're riffing on, or how does that work for you?
So it's early on, I realized I needed to write it, because I'm not like everybody else. I'm not a great talker. I start sentences, I don't finish them, I meander off. And the difference between normal talking and scripted talking is pretty profound. And so I realized, I have to write something. Also, the pieces are actually very choreographed with images and words and music. And so if you just are riffing, it kind of becomes a mess. So I Googled, how do you memorize long things? And of course, it was like, oh, there's tons of sites for actors. Yeah. Actors do this all the time. I thought it was like this unique conundrum. But
no one has ever memorized text and said it out loud before.
Yeah. So anyway, there are lots of websites where I learned how to memorize long things, and so I did that. But the challenge with the Lincoln Center thing is I've never done 3 different ones in a row.
Right.
So I had to, on Sunday morning, rememorize the Buckminster Fuller one. Because if I did it earlier, I think it would have gotten in the way. I would get confused
totally.
with the other 2. So that was like a unique test of like, how much can you really memorize things?
Right. And I also noticed that you've got a device in one hand.
Yeah.
Is that advancing the film? And then there was also a laser pointer attached to it, right?
The film, it's just a clicker. The film, the funny thing is it's a keynote presentation.
Right.
It's just images and QuickTimes in a keynote. It's literally a fancy PowerPoint presentation.
Right.
So that's the clicker where my laptop's right there and I'm just advancing it.
When you decided you wanted to make live performance part of your practice, did you feel like there was work you needed to do to become a live performer and to learn how to do it?
Yeah, actually, it's funny. I'd completely forgotten about this, but I worked with this guy in San Francisco who's works with people doing one-person shows. You know that place in San Francisco called The Marsh?
Yeah.
It's on Valencia, and it's like people have been doing one-person shows there for like 30 years, and they just, it's constant. I think it's even the same people, Charlie Varon. These people do one-person shows. So this guy named David Ford who worked there and sort of worked with people. I don't know how I connected with him. He was super helpful in teaching me how to write that. It's weird because if you know this doing theater, but I had to learn all this, the amount of information you can get across through gesture, through your face, that I'm making an expression right now that's saying something, and the writing can be incredibly terse. It's one thing to write for a disembodied narrator. That can be pretty terse, but you don't have all the facial and physical stuff. With speaking to people, it's a totally different, very specific kind of writing and talking. And it's funny, the same thing, I had that same weird epiphany once where I was like, I have learned so much about this esoteric art that nobody knows about, which is writing for talking, and then it was like, that's a screenplay, basically.
Right.
It sort of inadvertently become a screenplay writer. But
what have you learned? Is it like, like when I did a scripted podcast, for example, the guy who produced it or edited it was like, these sentences are too fucking long. It's like they have to be shorter.
Yeah.
You can't do this like very long, structurally complicated thing at a sentence level. No one will. It won't make sense. You know. So like, I'm just sort of curious. What are some of the lessons you've learned about scripting for live?
Two things. One, when I write, I just sit there and write and talk at the same time. So I'm like, here's the moment you've all been dreading. A history lesson. Like does you sort of write and say it at the same time. Because if you just for myself, if you just write it out and then say it later, like it's going to be way too long and ungainly. And then the other thing I learned, which is really interesting to me, is that probably to nobody else, but I find myself liking saying certain sentences and not liking saying other sentences. And that to me is the ultimate test of, is it good writing? Do I really like saying it? And if I do, that's somehow working. And oh God, this sentence, I never like saying this sentence, that's not good writing, I think, somehow.
That's amazing, because I've actually had playwrights say very similar things to
me.
Really? There's a writer, the playwright Anne Washburn said to me at one point that, and I'm only dropping her name to give her credit that this is not my observation. I'm not whatever. Anne's wonderful. But anyway, she said to me, actors are really great dramaturgs, because if you have an actor who is good at their job, right? It's a good actor, and there's like one sentence that they are continually stumbling on, you have to rewrite that sentence. Like there's just something about it that doesn't work. Yeah. It could be the word order, but it could actually be the meaning. Like it's your job to figure out what it is, but their subconscious is alerting them that something is wrong with the writing.
Yeah. Yeah.
I love reading. I mean, even my prose stuff I read out loud all the time before anyone reads it, because you just learn so much about it. It's really, your brain just does so much work automatically when you read it out loud.
100%. Yeah. It's really interesting. Yeah. It made me realize with films, at least, I mentioned I had always like really been like voiceover, yick.
Right.
And when I first realized, oh my God, I got to write some voiceover, I watched movies by Adam Curtis, the BBC documentary.
Of course.
And he comes on and he's like this schlubby British guy. You're like, oh, this is going to be terrible. But the writing is so good. He's such a good writer. It just endlessly engaging. And that really, I realized like, oh, voiceover gets a really bad rap because most people do it badly. If it's done badly, it's bad. But in rare instances, people can be great at it, and it's completely transcendent.
We're talking in part, as we mentioned, because there's a big retrospective of your work, all performed live, happening at Lincoln Center. You know, you've been doing these for a while. What have you learned about the form? Because you've sort of made up your own form, and then you get to learn about it, right? So what have you learned about it over that time?
I've learned many things about the form, but a couple things that come to mind are, I do think people are hungry for and appreciative of a reason to go out and see something. That we all watch a lot of things at home, and there's more and more, it's easier and easier to watch things at home and stay at home and get your food delivered to you at home and all that. And so to make something that's cool that people want to see and they have to go see it and they got to buy a ticket and they got to turn their phone off, I think people actually appreciate that. I appreciate it. I would like that, to do that. So that's one thing. I mean, the other thing I learned is that you can make a okay living doing live performances, which is something that I think music people had to learn, where like, unless you're Britney Spears, you're not making music money off your records. You have to go tour. So that was one other thing. And I guess the last one is just that, like, not something I learned, but maybe was reminded of, that's the magic of cinema. Big images and sounds that wash over you is what makes moviegoing magical. And so hanging on to that, and not only hanging on to it, but leaning into it, trying to make it as big as you possibly can. So with the movie I'm making about trees, I'm constantly just trying to, how could I go further with this? And so I'm making this movie about trees, which is very hard. And I was thinking, what is the biggest musical cinematic experience out there? And I thought orchestras, because a huge orchestra is like metal. It can be like enormous. And so I'm going to make a piece that will be performed with orchestras and a big screen, and it'll be great. And so that I'm excited about that.
Well, Sam Green, thank you so much. I can't wait to see the movie about trees. I'm so happy to have gotten to speak to you about your work. Thank you for joining us this week on Working.
Thank you, Isaac. It's been a real pleasure, and thanks for the great questions.
Up next, Isaac and I will talk about remixing artistic genres, the appeal of ephemeral art, and the joy of archival research. Isaac, I absolutely love that interview, and it really made me wish that I could experience Sam's work for myself. I was really struck by Sam's observation about the appeal of going into a performance without any expectations. When a piece of work doesn't fit into a familiar box, it's not clearly a play, it's not clearly a documentary film or a rock concert, the audience potentially comes in fresher. I am so curious what your experience of the Love Song of Our Buckminster Fuller was like. And I know I'm asking someone who is both a Yo La Tengo superfan and a connoisseur, and sometimes indeed a creator of non-traditional performing arts pieces.
Yeah, I thought that was a great point, because every art form, even experimental art forms, has a lineage, a history, expectations, cliches. What are you doing about those cliches? How is it working? Blah, 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 blah. They all do. And that was actually really eye-opening for me when I first moved to New York and was seeing a lot of experimental work and downtown work, to just be like, oh, wait, these are cliched. Like if it was a bad piece, do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
It's like
yeah.
the cliches are weird. They're not the cliches that someone coming from a traditional theater thing would expect, but these are cliches, right? So one way that you can avoid that is to kind of pioneer a new form, or to take some things of one form and some things of another and mash them up, right?
Yeah.
I will say, I have seen a lot of multimedia work. I have made live multimedia work. So I wouldn't say the form was particularly surprising in that way. The thing that was a surprise was how accessible and approachable it was. In that Sam, as you heard in the interview, he's a very affable guy. As he says, he's kind of a normal dude from the Midwest. He's very smart. But, you know, so it's like having an affable, smart, funny friend be the tour guide to their own obsessions, you know? And so it's not austere. It's not pushing the audience away as a lot of experimental work does. And sometimes alienating the audience is useful. I'm not actually saying that's bad. But what was different about it was as much attitudinal as formal. That it was welcoming, that it was accessible, that it was funny, that he's just talking to you. You know, that was the thing that actually I found the most refreshing.
Ooh, wow. Another thing I found fascinating was the way Sam talked about having personal breakthroughs, you know, realizing things about performance and interaction with audiences that he was pretty soon reminded are just essential truths of the art form. I love the story of his partner, a choreographer, essentially saying, yeah, duh, when he told her about feeding off the audience's reactions. Like, yeah, that's just a thing that you kind of learn when you do live performances. And I have to admit, I had a similar experience recently. I gave a lecture at a university and I was there with my slides and my text. And for a minute, I swear I thought, this is an artistic breakthrough. I should take this on the road. And then pretty soon I realized, you know, actually this happens in classrooms all across the world every single day. And I don't tell this story to make myself, and certainly much less Sam, seem delusional. It's good to look at familiar forms in a new way, or just kind of not just draw the immediate conclusion. No, like you're just doing something everybody else does. And Sam really does seem to have found really interesting ways of reapproaching what we know of live performance and movies. Still, I guess, Isaac, what I want you to do is kind of talk me down. Is this kind of, I'm going to create a new genre approach, one that you recommend people explore? I just keep thinking, there was only one Spalding Gray. There's only one Mike Daisy, one Sam Green.
Yeah, you know, one thing that I think your question points to, if I can just totally veer off on an exit ramp for a second, is that, or a rural byway. I'm getting off I-95 and onto Route 1 because there's too much traffic and I need to get to DC. More seriously though, is that there is something very satisfying about the form of the lecture demonstration. And it is an underutilized genre or formal conceit or whatever you want to talk about it that more artists should be exploring. There was a wonderful play that ran off Broadway for a couple years called Underneath the Lintel by Glenn Berger, who went on to write the Spider-Man musical, that is a kind of fake lecture demonstration. It's a guy giving a lecture to the audience about this thing that he has discovered as the result of a library book that was overdue by more than 100 years. And then, Raja Feather Kelly, who was a guest on this show, I've seen a piece of Raja's that was, when we did a residency together, at the end of that residency, that was a lecture demo about the work that he was developing. And I was like, this is the show. You don't actually need to do anything beyond this. The Civilians, the documentary theater company I've worked with a bunch of times, they did these kind of demos of what they had learned that were sometimes as thrilling as the show. So it's just to say, I think Sam's work on one level is this totally new form that's mashing up live performance and documentary. But it's also this very old form, which is the lecture demonstration, right? Yeah. Thomas Edison electrocuting the elephant or whatever it was, The other thing I would say is, Mike Daisy is influenced by Spalding Gray.
Yeah.
Right. There was only one Spalding Gray, but there is also the only one Mike Daisy had influences. Spalding Gray had influences. Sam has influences. I think it would be great if more people were trying to do this kind of work whether it's Mike Daisy's extemporaneous performance or Sam Green's, live documentary, to create a tradition out of it. If you made a live documentary or if I made one, it wouldn't be the same as Sam's. Like, even if the formal elements were extremely similar. To just give one example, like if I did it, it would probably have some staging in it. There would probably be some stuff going on the stage visually more because I'm also a theater director and that's my sensibility. If you did it, maybe it would be still images, not moving pictures because you think of it as slides and not as visuals. I think there's a rich tradition there to be both to explore and to be created.
Ooh,
so I will not talk you down. In other words, I'm going to talk you up, June.
I
look forward to flying out to the Edinburgh Fringe Festival to see, your hour-long lecture demo on bullet journals.
Exactly. Hold my ladder. Hold the ladder. I'm climbing, Isaac. I'm climbing.
Exactly.
All right. I was fascinated by your interaction with Sam about the nature of live performance, and I wondered if you could talk about the evolution of your relationship with ephemerality. Maybe I'm wrong about this, but I think ephemerality is something a lot of artists kind of let go of over the course of their careers, some reluctantly, some not. Maybe their band doesn't take off the way they'd like. They take on responsibilities, a mortgage. They turn to artistic pursuits that have a more family-friendly schedule. They don't so much reject ephemeral art as reject the life circumstances that go with it. But live performance really does sound like a unique buzz. I have not ever felt that buzz since I was in a play in high school. But I wonder, is the thrill of ephemerality something you miss, Isaac? Something you've tried to recreate in some way as you've shifted more to the non-ephemeral world of nonfiction book writing?
So I do wonder if sometimes those of us involved in the live arts talk up ephemerality as a kind of mythological thing to comfort ourselves for the fact that when we die, there will be nothing to show for our life's work. There is part of me that worries about that because there's part of me that just worries about all sorts of different myths that kind of guide our lives. And I do think we should be self-critical and introspective to make sure we haven't sold ourselves a bill of goods, right?
Yeah.
But I do think there is nothing like the power of a truly great live performance that you are in the room for, whether you are the performer or the audience member. It has a singular, almost impossible to put into language, exhilarating feeling. And that I'm really hooked on it. That's why I became someone who made theater. I was really hooked on it actually as much as an audience member as anything else. There is nothing ephemeral about writing a book. There just isn't, right? It's like even if the whole book was improvised and you didn't revise it or whatever, well, you got to go through a production process. It'll be copy edited and then it's put, that's not ephemeral.
Yeah.
So the question is, how do you make the live experience, the book events, the lectures you do, the stuff like that, feel more alive? The best version of that was when Dan and I toured for The World Only Spins Forward. We would do these events where, because it was an oral history, we would get 8 to 10 friends / celebrities in whatever city we were in, and we would just give them the script with highlighted parts, but they weren't allowed to read it before they walked out on stage. And so they would have to just be dealing with it. And then the whole point was when you were done with the page, you would throw it in the air, right? So at the end, the whole stage would be covered in paper and everything like that. And that was a really fun experience. We had a lot of people say from venues be like, that's the best book event I've ever seen. But the reason why was because it wasn't just someone standing there being like, and then he unbuttoned the top collar of his shirt. Jessica, he said, I think I'm dying. Right? It wasn't that.
Yeah.
It was exuberant and funny. It didn't take itself seriously, but also you knew when you were there that no one else was ever going to have that experience.
Mm-hmm. I loved your little interlude about archival finds, a massive box of Brat Pack headshots. That was a pretty good story. I wonder though, have you come across anything else you'd care to share with the audience?
Well, I just do want to say one thing about the Bruce Willis headshot, which is that he has hair in it and he looks older in it than he does now. That was the weird thing about it. It's and on the back of it, it says, in the skills, the actors always have the skills that are driver's license, but one of them is blues harmonica, which I thought was great because he cut that album of blues harmonica. He had like a harmonica, like a bar band kind of thing.
Wow.
What about you, June? What at the Lesbian Archive in Park Slope? You must have found something.
Well,
amazing there.
it's funny. Its orderliness is a little unique. So often you do just kind of find things. Actually, though, I have to say that I want to kind of not bring us down, but like sometimes you make an appointment to see somebody's stuff, and when you get there, it's a disappointment, but not so much because like in that sort of bizarre way that when you are doing research for a book, you're looking for that little zingy thing that's going to set off an alarm, and it's going to be like, oh my goodness, this is going to be 4 pages here. I'm gonna this is solid gold. Sometimes
no one's written about this. That's the great thing, right? When you're like,
Yeah,
I have
exactly,
found this piece
exactly.
of paper that I've not seen
Yeah.
in any other book on
Yes.
this subject, and I
Exactly.
am going to be able to, like, this is where the ego comes in a little bit,
Yeah, exactly.
right?
Exactly. Absolutely. But then those times, which is actually more common, when you don't find anything like that, and you make an appointment, you wait a long time, you get there, and then it's just kind of like sad life stuff, because a lot of people do like have hard lives that end up, in ways that we wouldn't hope for ourselves, kind of thing, and especially if there's some big thing in a special box. Almost never is that big thing in the special box actually of interest. Like, I think maybe the person had to be wearing it for it to like have any resonance. So again, not to bring us down, but sometimes it's not always all that great. So just kind of sad things from people's sad lives sometimes like have a sad resonance that's attached
Right.
to them that for a few minutes at least can bring the recipient down. We've got to stop there before we get super dark.
I gotta end us on a brighter note than that. Okay,
Oh, please,
which was a big
please.
thing in a special box that was actually quite wonderful, which is the group theater. Most of the second part of the method, it's in 3 parts. A lot of the second part is about the group theater. It's where the method was really codified, where they really adapted these Russian ideas into an American theatrical style and language. And their first summer, when they did a retreat upstate to kind of train together and create what became the group theater, they kept a group diary where each member of the group wrote an entry and then it reset. So each member wrote 2 entries, and I actually held the physical copy of it at Lee Strasberg's papers. Like, I found it and I was like, oh my God, Clifford Odets had it and he had given it to Lee. And so it was in Lee's papers. And it was just like, the moment where Indiana Jones holds the cup of the carpenter. That's really what it felt like. It kind of like there was like almost like a magical light coming off of it. And then you open it and it's almost illegible because it's people writing. It's crazy artist handwriting, right? So what did I do? I scanned it. I sent it to my freelance research assistant and I was like, do your best. And then she sent me a Microsoft Word document with it. But there's something, it was so great because you were like, oh my God, Clifford Odets wrote in this, Lee Strasberg wrote in this, Stella Adler wrote in this, some of the great actors and teachers of their era, wrote in this, and they were like dumb 25-year-olds or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And then they eventually start arguing with each other over the course of the document, over the entries and everything. And it was was everything I could have hoped for and more. So
Thank you.
Did I
for
bring
bringing us back up.
Yeah, there we go.
Yes. And on that beautiful, uplifting note, it's time to go. We hope you enjoyed the show, listeners. If you have, remember to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. That way, you will never miss an episode. And just a reminder that by joining Slate Plus, you'll get ad-free podcasts, extra segments on some wonderful Slate shows, and you will never hit a paywall on the Slate site. To learn more, go to slate.com/workingplus.
Thank you to Sam Green and to our wonderful producer, Cameron Drews, who spins the hay of our extemporaneous live performances into gold on a weekly basis. We'll be back next week with Ronald's conversation with sound designer John Delore. Until then, get back to work.
This is the story of the one. As head of maintenance at a concert hall, he knows the show must always go on. That's why he works behind the scenes, ensuring every light is working, the HVAC is humming, and his facility shines. With Granger's supplies and solutions for every challenge he faces, plus 24/7 customer support, his venue never misses a beat. Call quickgranger.com or just stop by. Granger, for the ones who get it done.